The wind was bitter that morning, sharp enough to sting the skin, cold enough to bite the bones. In the shadow of the hills, where the sun had not yet dared to rise, a noose swayed gently in the chill breeze. It hung from an old sycamore tree. Near the center of the village square, its rope frayed from years of hangings and warnings. Crows circled above, as if they knew the feast was near. A small crowd had gathered, silent and grim, their breath forming clouds in the early winter air. Her name was Zareen, barefoot, bruised. Dressed in torn white, her wrists bound in front of her, she stood quietly beneath the noose. Her eyes were not afraid, not anymore. She had cried all night until her tears froze on her face, until her voice broke from screaming. Now, there was only silence left in her, a cold acceptance. They said she had killed a man, the landlord's son, a man known for violence hidden behind his father's money. They said Zareen had stabbed him in the chest when he tried to force himself on her in the dark of his father's barn. They said she confessed. What they didn't say was that no one in the village believed the trial was fair. But no one had the courage to speak. Until now. 3 hills away, deep in the folds of a worn-out shack nestled at the edge of the forest, Darya Khan bolted upright from his sleep. Someone was banging on the old wooden door. He grabbed the rifle by his bedside, eyes wild, still half dreaming. The voice outside was familiar. "She's gonna die, Darya. They're hanging her at Fajr." He didn't even wait to think. His heart surged. Without a word, he grabbed his belt, fastened the knife to his boot, flung his shawl over his shoulder, and stepped out. The world was still dark and frost clung to the ground. He mounted his horse, a dark stallion named Raksha, and kicked hard. The sound of hooves echoed like gunshots in the silence. Darya Khan was no outlaw. He was just a broken man with nothing left to lose. Once, he had been a farmer. He had owned 4 acres of good soil, a loving wife, a young boy. Then the flood came. The river rose like a curse and swallowed his life whole. His son was taken by the water, his wife by grief, and his land taken by debt. Now he lived like a shadow at the edge of town, digging graves to eat and hunting in the woods to survive. They said he spoke to ghosts, that he was mad. But there was one person who had ever treated him like a human, Zareen. She brought him bread when others turned away. She patched his coat. When the village mocked him, she'd look them in the eye and say, "One day he will save more than himself." As Darya reached the edge of the square, the crowd parted in stunned silence. He didn't dismount. He raised his rifle, its barrel gleaming in the torchlight. The hangman froze. Then Darya said 5 words that would be etched into every mouth in that village for years. "She is my bride now." Gasps, murmurs. The village elder stepped forward. "Darya, this is madness." "I'll take her," Darya said, voice steady. "You hang me instead." But before another word could be uttered, he pulled Zareen up behind him. The crowd panicked. Some screamed. One man raised a musket. Darya fired into the air. Then Raksha turned and thundered out of the square, hooves tearing the frozen earth. The chase began. Half the village was on horseback within minutes, their torches a fiery river down the slopes. They knew the forest like their own breath. But Darya knew its secrets. Twice they nearly caught him. Once, he was surrounded at a broken bridge. He leapt over it, the stallion bleeding from the jump. Another time, they shot at him. A bullet tore through his left arm. He didn't stop. He rode till the trees grew thick and the sky lightened with the first blush of dawn. Then he collapsed. In a cave far in the northern ridge, Zareen pressed a cloth to his wound. "I told you you'd save someone," she whispered. "He smiled faintly, teeth gritted in pain. "And you're not hanging today." Tears slipped from her cheeks. "Why did you come?" His eyes, dark and filled with the weight of 100 storms, met hers. "Because I remember what kindness feels like. You didn't turn away from me when I was nothing. I couldn't turn away now." The cave was cold. Not the kind of cold that simply bites, the kind that seeps into the soul. Snow flurries whispered just outside, and the cave mouth glowed faint blue with the creeping light of dawn. Zareen crouched beside Daria, her fingers trembling as she tied another knot in the bandage. The bullet had torn through the muscle in his left arm. Clean pass, but bleeding wouldn't stop. She had seen death before. It was a regular guest in their kind of life. But never had she fought this hard to hold it back. He was losing heat fast. She pulled her thin shawl tighter, then stripped off her outer camise and placed it over his chest. Her hands moved with instinct. Pressure, cloth, check for exit wound. But her heart was shaking. Daria's breathing slowed. His eyes fluttered open briefly. "You'll freeze," he rasped. "And you'll bleed to death," she replied, voice sharp with fear. "I won't let either happen. Sleep now. Save your strength." By mid-morning, the snow had begun to fall heavier. Their tracks would be covered soon, a blessing. Zareen kept herself busy. She gathered twigs, used flint from Daria's belt pouch to spark a fire. She heated stones, placed them near his side, melted snow in a tin cup, found a patch of dry moss for warmth. He drifted in and out of fever dreams, whispering names she didn't know. Aryan, Kalsum, a river too high. She realized then, he hadn't just lost people. He was still losing them every night. By the second night, he was conscious again. "You're stronger than I remember," he murmured, watching her tend the fire. She didn't look at him. "I'm just trying to keep us alive. You always were the only one with a spine in that village." This time she met his eyes. "Then why did you run from it all?" The question hung heavy in the cave, like smoke. He looked away. "I didn't run, Zareen, I drowned. And when no one pulls you out, sometimes you learn to breathe under the water." And they stayed in that cave for 3 days. Outside, the villagers searched, but the snow buried all trace. The forest protected them. Zareen found roots, berries, and once caught a rabbit in a trap. She fed him slowly, taught him to move his arm bit by bit. In those days, something quiet and fragile passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but a kind of mutual recognition. Two broken people, the world having failed both, holding each other up with what little they had. She told him her side of the story. How she worked as a maid in the landlord's home. How she had learned to walk softly, speak less, survive. How the landlord's son had tried to take more than what she could survive. How she fought back. How the justice they offered her was a rope and a lie. Daria didn't speak for a long time after that. Then he said, "If I had a daughter, I would have wanted her to be like you." She looked away, but her throat clenched. On the 4th night, Daria stood up fully. The fever had broken. The wound had begun to heal. He was pale, thin, but fire returned to his eyes. "We can't hide forever," he said. "No," Zareen agreed, "but we can choose where we go next." They rode north, out of the village's reach, past the river border that divided districts, past the farms that knew their names. On the 7th day, they reached a small border town, Chakarkot, a place of refugees, lost men, broken women, and no questions. Daria found work guarding caravans. Zareen started cooking in a roadside chai stall, and for the first time in years both of them breathed. But peace is not cheap. One evening, 2 men walked into the chai stall, polished boots, soft voices, but cruelty in their eyes. "Zareen," one said, as if tasting the word, "you made quite a name in Miranpur. That landlord's still offering gold for your return." Zareen didn't flinch. She had learned from Daria. Fear was a choice. "Tell him," she said calmly. "He'll get nothing but shame." They laughed. "You think shame stops men like him?" That night, she told Daria everything. He didn't ask her to run. He didn't offer revenge. He simply said, "Then we stay, and we fight smart." 3 days later, the men returned. This time, with 5 others. But they didn't find Zareen alone. They found Daria Khan standing in the alley behind the stall, his arm still healing, his rifle leveled. They called him a fool. An old man clinging to honor. He shot the first in the leg before they finished the insult. Zareen stabbed the second with a kitchen blade. The rest fled. The local elders took notice. An inquiry followed. The town's council, made up of traders, smugglers, ex-soldiers, and widows, heard the full story. When it was over, the eldest woman among them stood and said, "You have defended your name with truth, and you have protected this village with blood. From this day, you both belong to us." Months passed. Daria and Zareen built a home on the edge of Chakar Kot. She opened a school for orphaned girls. He trained young men to farm, to fight, to think. People began calling him Baba Daria, not out of age, but respect. They lived simply, but never quietly. And one morning, long after winter had melted into green, Zareen stood beside Daria as the village unveiled a plaque in his name. She whispered, "You didn't just save me." He looked at the crowd of children, of mothers, of workers. "You saved me too," he said. It had been nearly a year since that bitter winter morning, when a man with nothing dared to save a girl with no one. Chakar Kot had changed. Slowly, quietly, but deeply. Where once it was a forgotten edge of the map town, known only for dust, tired merchants, and silent suffering, now it breathed again. The tea stall, where Zareen once boiled lentils for coins, now had 3 helpers. Behind it stood a 2-room school where barefoot girls practiced their letters, their voices loud and alive. Daria, though still weathered and quiet, had grown into a figure of strength, not through power, but presence. He built fences, repaired broken carts, taught boys to hunt with honor, and taught girls to shoot when needed. He never asked to lead, but one by one, they followed him. One afternoon, as the sun poured gold over the market, an unfamiliar man arrived in the town square. He was well-dressed, boots polished, and eyes sharp. His accent wasn't local. He bought a cup of tea and sat under the neem tree, watched, listened, said nothing. That evening, a letter arrived at the stall. It was sealed in red wax. Zareen read it once, then twice. Then she folded it slowly and turned to Daria. "They found us." The landlord had died. But his younger brother now sat in power, colder and more cunning. He didn't want revenge, not directly, no noise, no blood. Instead, he offered a deal. Return quietly to Miranpur, accept banishment, face no trial, or refuse, and see Chakar Kot punished for harboring you. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. That night, Daria called a gathering at the schoolhouse. Everyone came, elders, mothers, laborers, children. Zareen stood before them and told the truth, every brutal detail, the attack, the false trial, the hanging, the escape, the new threat. She ended with a single sentence. "I will not bring ruin upon the people who gave me a second life." But before she could say more, an old man stood, He had lost 2 sons in the border skirmishes years ago. One of them had, Tim, been taught how to track and shoot by Daria. He spoke with a voice like gravel and thunder. "You gave us dignity, child. If they want war, we'll give them shame instead." Others joined him. A woman with only one leg said, "This is our home now, let them come." Even the chai boy raised his hand and said, "Let's teach them what chakarkot means." But Daria was silent. Later, alone with Zareen, he spoke. "We can't let this town burn for us." Zareen's hands were folded tightly in her lap. "They are choosing, we're not asking. But I am." His eyes were haunted. "I buried too many people I loved. I won't bury strangers who stood up for me." Zareen stood up. "I was ready to die a year ago, Daria. That noose was tied, and I didn't flinch." She stepped closer, her voice low but fierce. "But you didn't let me die, not because you could shoot, but because you believed I mattered. Even when no one else did. If we run now, what does that belief mean?" A decision was made. They would not run, but they would not play by the landlord's rules either. Over the next 2 weeks, Chakarkot transformed. It became a fortress without walls. Trap lines were set on the outer roads. Scouts placed on the hills. Messages were sent to nearby nomadic tribes that had once traded with the village. They remembered Daria, the man who once stitched up a boy's leg for free or helped bury a chieftain's son with respect. Help came, not in guns or armies, but in loyalty. Caravans diverted goods to the village. Lookouts were posted along trade paths. When the landlord's envoys arrived, they found empty stalls, quiet eyes, and no answers. Their intimidation failed, but violence came anyway. One night, just before moonrise, 3 armed men snuck into the village. They set fire to the stables, trying to flush people out. What they didn't know was that Daria had been waiting. He was there, rifle ready, before the second torch could light. 1 attacker died. 2 were captured. But in the chaos, a girl, no older than 10, was burned. Zareen held her in her lap all night, singing lullabies through tears. She died at dawn. The funeral was silent, but what followed was not. Zareen stood over the girl's grave, hands trembling, eyes blazing. "No more mercy," she said. Daria looked at her, and something in his face cracked. He hadn't cried in years, but this time he did. For the child, for the war that had found them, for the part of him that knew. Peace must sometimes be paid in fire. The next day, the 2 captured men were brought before the council. Zareen wanted justice. The council demanded strategy. Daria made a decision. He released them, but with a message. "Tell your master, we are not hiding, we are waiting." It wasn't a bluff. It was a line drawn. For 3 days after the fire, the village was quieter than usual. Children no longer played near the school. The women kept pots covered and conversations shorter. Even the chai had lost its usual sweetness. And the weight of the little girl's death hung like smoke. Not loud, not wailing, but ever present. A slow ache behind every heartbeat. Daria stood at the edge of the burned stable each morning, staring at the ashes, remembering the flames, the screams, the silence that followed. He had seen too much death in his life, but there was something different about this one. Maybe because it wasn't a soldier or a fighter or someone already marked by sorrow. It was an innocent. And once again, he felt the curse, that violence seemed to follow him wherever he dared to believe in something. Good, Zareen changed. She was still the same in body, sharp, quick, focused. But something inside her hardened like stone. She started training the village girls with knives, teaching them how to move silently, where to strike if cornered. "You think it's over," she told one skeptical mother. "It's just beginning." She, no longer flinched when talking about the landlord. She said his name aloud now. Sikandar Mirza. He doesn't want justice, she said. He wants obedience. And the only way he wins is if we give it to him. Meanwhile, Daria sent word to his last living contact from the old days, a man named Siddiq. Once a smuggler, now an informant, Siddiq knew the underbelly of the region like the back of his dust-stained hands. He arrived one evening with only a half-smoked cigarette and a blood-stained satchel. They sat on the roof of the school as dusk fell. Mirza has paid bounty hunters, Siddiq said flatly. Not amateurs, real ones. They don't care about law, only gold. Daria nodded. They know you won't leave. That's why they're coming with silence and poison. He paused, then added, they're planning to strike the school. That night, Daria didn't sleep. He sat by the fire with his rifle across his knees, eyes open, thinking. Every decision he had made, from the moment he grabbed that girl and ran into the dawn, had brought them here. Was it worth it? He thought of the child in the grave. He thought of Zareen's voice, steady even when broken, and then he heard her speak from the doorway behind him. You saved me once. Let me save them now. He didn't answer. But the next morning, they built a wall around the school, tall, crude, but strong. And above the entrance, they carved words in old Punjabi. We are not afraid. 3 nights later they came. Just after midnight, 5 men, all in black, faces wrapped, knives drawn. They slipped through the back paths, past the edge of the fields, through the narrow alleys that Siddiq had warned about. What they didn't know was that the children were not sleeping in the school that night. They were in the basement of the tea stall, under guard, and that Zareen, dressed in black, was waiting on the roof, bow drawn, heart steady. She didn't hesitate. Her arrow struck the first man through the shoulder. The second fell into a pit trap. Daria had set himself. The third was clubbed unconscious by a teenage girl wielding a hammer. By dawn, 2 were dead. 1 captured, 2 vanished. The town woke to find blood on the walls, but no bodies of their own. This time, they had defended. The captured man was made to speak. Sikandar Mirza was growing desperate. His name was being whispered in cities as a tyrant who couldn't control a small village. More bounty was promised. More lies spread. But something had shifted. The story was spreading too. The real story, of the girl who was nearly hanged for defending her dignity, of the gunslinger who rode into the gallows and called her his bride, of a village that chose justice over fear. By the time spring came, Chakar Kot was no longer alone. Travelers stopped to see the school. Journalists wrote anonymous letters to regional papers. One headline read, "The village that said no." And then came the moment no one expected. An old black car pulled into the village square. Out stepped a woman in a faded green uniform. District Magistrate, the first government official to step foot in Chakar Kot in 5 years. She carried with her 3 documents. A full pardon for Zareen, signed and sealed under new judicial orders. An arrest warrant for Sikandar Mirza, now accused of multiple crimes. A deed of recognition, officially declaring Chakar Kot an autonomous village under protection of the state. The people were stunned. Zareen held the paper in shaking hands. Daria, for once, sat down. The magistrate simply said, "Your story forced us to see what we refused to see. Sometimes change doesn't come from the top. It comes from the blood in the ground." That night, the village celebrated, not with fireworks, but with lamps. They lit hundreds of small clay lamps and set them across the rooftops, across the fields, even in the schoolyard. Zareen and Daria, stood side by side, watching the light reach every corner. He looked at her and asked, "Do you still think I saved you?" She smiled, eyes full but calm. "I think we saved each other." It had been 3 years since the day of the gallows. 3 years since the gunslinger rode through the fog of dawn, placed his hand around a noose, and said to a girl no one had wanted to save, "She's mine." Now Chakakot stood taller. The village had grown, not in luxury, but in reputation. There were new roofs, new hands, new hope. Children who once feared fire now ran barefoot in safe courtyards. Girls who had been taught silence now recited poems aloud in the classroom Zareen had built with her own hands. And above the blackboard, carved in burnt wood, were words that every child knew by heart. "What you stand for must be stronger than what stands against you." Darya had grown older, not slower, wiser. He no longer carried a rifle on his shoulder, but the village boys still came to him for advice, for stories, for that look in his eyes that said, "You can face it." He had scars, his arm never fully healed. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, the war memories still came. But Zareen was always there. She never tried to silence his past. She simply held him through it. And in that, he found peace, not forgetting, but forgiving. Himself, most of all. One evening, just after the first summer rain, a stranger arrived. He looked no different from the dozens who had come to learn, to trade, to see the miracle village. But this one was different. He brought a letter. Old, folded 100 times. Written by Darya's sister, years ago, when Darya had disappeared into the mountains, leaving his family behind in guilt and grief. "You were always the one who stood up first," it read. "We didn't understand your pain. We judged your silence. But know this, we never stopped loving you." The stranger was a cousin. He had searched for months. "Your sister, she passed last year," he said quietly, "but she died believing you were alive. That somewhere, you were doing what you always did, protecting someone." Darya didn't cry. He simply walked to the tree behind the school and tied the letter to its branch. Let the wind carry it. Later that night, Zareen found him staring at the fire. He said, "There are still things I wish I could go back and change." She nodded. "So do I. But we built something better from the wreckage. That matters more." He looked at her, then at the flames, then back again. "I never asked you." "What?" "If you would have said yes, if I'd asked for your hand, not in escape, not in protection, but in love." She smiled, tired and true. "I've already said yes, Darya, every day without a word." The next morning, under the same neem tree where the first warning letter was once read, the village gathered. Zareen wore a simple white kurta. Darya wore the same belt he'd strapped his gun to that morning long ago. But today, no guns. No fear, no masks. Just truth. The village elder, now a grandmother who had once hidden them in her cellar, presided over the nikah. There were no cameras, no guests from cities, only family. The kind you earn. Years passed, and legends grew. People came from other broken towns, from orphaned villages, to ask how Chakakot had survived when others fell. Darya always answered the same. We stopped waiting for someone to save us. We saved each other. One day, a girl arrived alone, 15, bruises on her arms, silence in her throat. Zareen took her in. She let her sleep, then fed her, then handed her a knife. Not to fight, to carve wood. She showed her how to build her own name again. The girl never spoke her past, but slowly she started to sing. That was the legacy. Not battle, not rebellion. Healing. Time, Darya died, not by a bullet, not by fire. He died on the porch he built with his own hands, under a sky full of stars, holding Zareen's hand. His last words were, "Tell them, we made it." Zareen lived many years after. She became a name girls whispered in their own prayers, not as a savior, but as a survivor who taught them how to stand when the world asked them to kneel. When she passed, they buried her beside Darya. A single tombstone, one sentence.